March NRASP luncheon. Quick announcements here as we get rolling for the day. As a reminder, we're working towards getting to that hybrid model. Still, the board is making sure that we're staying vigilant from the standpoint of the health and safety, basically, of our membership when we go from a virtual option to a in-person or a hybrid type of a model. We're hoping to accomplish that in the next couple, 2 to 3 months. In the meantime, of course, we'll have gift cards that'll be going out and continuing to go out. And we'll also be sending out, the way that we accomplish that is by basically ensuring that you're registered and attend. If you were attending with a friend, make sure that you're emailing out that information to Becky Harold or Dale Larson. That information on their contact information will be sent out in the announcements as well as the survey. Moving into the survey piece of it, please make sure that you are taking the time to fill out that survey. Those responses are very important to us to be able to give feedback to our memberships, etc. So as well, we can also get the coworker out their gift card as well. So we keep track of that as well. The other piece of this is to make sure that you submit any suggestions for future topics. To segue that into our upcoming topics, in April, we'll have business continuity. Matt Weiss from MMA will be speaking on that. In May, Dr. Jorgensen of Red River Chiro and Wellness will be speaking on boosting employee performance. In June, we have Kara Fieber from Cardinal IG talking about the importance of communication and safety. And then in July, the intention is to have our ASSP partners give us a topic, and we're still waiting for that topic to come through. As a reminder and a save the date, we're coming up on our annual conference. The planning committee has already kicked off. That date for you to put into your calendars, November 30th and December 1st. We plan to host this at the Delta, and it will be an in-person event with some potential of possibly a hybrid option. Our community outreach and scholarship program has identified 3 young ladies that are going into the healthcare field this coming December. Actually, the awards were made in December, but they'll be going to school here this fall. And as we get more information about them, we are going to try and introduce you to each of them. So you understand where your dollars, when you support the golf outing, etc., go for scholarship in the community outreach. As a reminder, from a communication standpoint, we have our presence on Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter and YouTube. Make sure you're liking those posts, resharing them, sending them to fellow safety professionals or others that it might make sense to view, etc. The more traction we can get from an electronic and a social media standpoint, the better it is for us to reach out and make sure that we're providing these services to more and more organizations. So please take that time to share these links. That gives us opportunity to do more community outreach, etc. Moving into today's topic, today we have our guest speaker, Bill Williams with OECS. He's here to talk to us today about hearing conservation and what you need to know to keep your employees safe and your organization compliant. Bill, are you all ready?
I think so. I'm going to share my screen here. Just want to verify if everybody is seeing the screen. If anybody can indicate.
I have it.
Okay, yep. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I want to first start off by just thanking you for the opportunity. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about hearing conservation and just the physics of sound. My background is pretty laden in the sciences, and so I apologize if that sort of approach turns you off here, but it I think is quite applicable when we're talking about sound and hearing conservation. I have an undergraduate in chemistry and speech communications, and then I also have a master's in engineering, and I'm a certified industrial hygienist, and I've been working around noise exposures for decades now. To me, it's a pretty important topic. I enjoy the topic because of its complexity. I think of it as an elephant that can be eaten one bite at a time, and it's something that you can always do continuous improvement with. And my objective for this presentation is to provide you with some information about sound and noise. And I hope, even if you've been involved in it as long as I have, that you might find some of it interesting and new and a little bit different. But if you're just starting on this path with safety, I want to give you a framework as to how to start a hearing conservation program and how to determine. And so I'll keep it quite simple too. And then I'll just be talking about applicability of the standard, the compliance requirements of the standard, and then management. And then I'll keep an eye on the clock too. And if there are any questions, please forward them through the chat. And I do not mind being interrupted. And if Becky thinks that it's a question that's relevant to the topic at hand, she'll interrupt me and we can have that discussion. But I hope this is a good opportunity for us to exchange information, and I'll just begin my presentation with a little bit of the history of noise. So back in the 6th century BCE, the first known ordinance for noise came from a Greek province, and what they were upset about is many of the occupational workers that were working and had set up shop in town for pottering or doing tinsmithing or other trades. They just got too darn loud, and so they made an ordinance that all of that work had to be done. So maybe that was the first industrial park too, but they also added that roosters had to get out of town as well. In the 5th century BCE, Hippocrates identified and defined tinnitus, a ringing of the ears, and he associated it with an exposure to noise. And so this phenomena of sound began to be linked with medicine. I'm going to skip ahead a few centuries here, but in the late 16th century, England had another ordinance that I just thought was quite interesting, because it detailed forbidding of sound in the still of the night as anything making an affray, such as beating your wife or beating your servant or singing or reveling inside your house. But essentially it was the first peace ordinance and defined laws and repercussions for disturbing the peace. Another link to medicine again came in 1831, where Dr. John Fosbrook linked blacksmiths, a specific occupation, with deafness or loss of hearing. And so that correlation between occupational noise exposure and a health effect really began to be defined in the 1800s. There are other phenomena that affect sound and noise. The first instrument, called a Rayleigh disc, was invented in 1880. It was a very sensitive device that it could only be used indoors because it was so easily broken. But the scientists were beginning to understand this physical phenomena of sound and were able to gather more information so people could make good decisions of it. And then in 1883, Krakatoa exploded, which is thought to be the largest natural sound ever encountered. This sound wave was so powerful that it traveled around the world 7 times in the 5 days after the explosion of Krakatoa. The loudest sound that can occur, because of the physics involved with our atmosphere and pressure differentials, is thought to be 194 decibels. At 100 miles away, 172 decibels were reported from Krakatoa. So that was definitely a big bang. And then again, Thomas Barr made an additional link to Boilermakers and the loss of hearing. What was also happening at the same time, and that's relevant even today, is he made a correlation between what's considered normal hearing and what's a hearing loss. So he kind of was the father of that path. And it's a very important understanding for us today because that is integrated into the hearing conservation standard. In the next century, all sorts of things happened. World War II, the Industrial Revolution, what it really did was it brought noise into our daily lives. Machinery, noise generation that we had never anticipated or expected or had to deal with before was just something we went through. And for many years, there were ANSI standards and recommendations because it was known that noise was a health hazard. So in 1971, the OSHA standard 1910-95 was promulgated. And this started with a very simple objective. Its objective was, if there is a hazard, you either remove the hazard or you remove the worker. That was by design. In 71, they wanted a standard that everybody could comply with. They just wanted this to be easy for everybody in industry. They set the level at 90 decibels, which is a measure of the power or the force of a sound wave. And they said, if your employees are exposed to that, or on average over 8 hours, you either fix it or you make sure the employee is not exposed to that. A really simple program. Well, as simple as they thought that was, there was huge complexity and there was quite a bit of resistance from industry as a whole. And even the standard itself went through some problems. It wasn't 8 months later that many of the people supporting the standard said we should move to an 85 decibel level, not a 90 decibel level. So for whatever reason, there's always been controversy associated with the hearing conservation standard since its inception in 1971. Finally, years later, in 1981, an amendment was put into place. And I've got to tell you, this did not simplify things. If anything, what it really did was it turned around the hierarchy of hazard management, OSHA's hierarchy. The original inception was that if there's a hazard present, you eliminate it. What this standard essentially did in this amendment is it created what's known as the Hearing Conservation Program. And it said, well, we understand employees are going to be exposed to noise. And so what do we got to do to protect them? Because it is too darn hard for industry to eliminate noise. Well, the political, the economic, and the regulatory environment accepted that premise at the time and developed what's called an action level, which happens to be 85 decibels. Now, the permissible exposure level or the hazard level still exists at 90 decibels. But now, instead of eliminating the hazard, we have to monitor employees that are exposed at this level, 85 decibels or more. We have to look towards protecting them with hearing protective devices. So many of you have seen that pyramid that has elimination at the top of it and PPE at the bottom. What's happened with hearing protection or the hearing conservation standard is PPE now seems to be at the top. People think, well, we just got to put hearing plugs in and we're good to go. And many of the original proponents of hearing conservation, people that are strong advocates, really struggle with that because they still believe the intent should be to eliminate the hazard. What's happened since then is science has helped us a lot. We're much better at doing a lot of things. And culturally, I believe there's been a difference since the early 2000s. And I think there's a culture of understanding out there that noise is something we need to protect people against, because hearing conservation is very important to us because we inherently recognize it's one of our senses. Life is better when we have the ability to hear. And what I've seen, because a little bit more history here, in the 90s, OSHA was putting out certain memos that really convoluted the enforcement of the OSHA standard. But I want you to know that there is still enforcement going on, and that's a very important reason why we want to participate in a hearing conservation program. But at the same time, I think this cultural understanding of many people involved in safety and employees bringing the fact up that they're uncomfortable working in a noisy environment has brought about some good positive changes, with companies of all sizes being active in hearing conservation programs. This is an example of a citation a company received in 2014. Not that this is the sole motivation to participate in a hearing conservation program or to have one, but I want you to certainly understand that there are financial consequences to it. This is a company in Texas that essentially choose to give OSHA the finger. And that's about the nicest way to say it. But they chose not to participate in the hearing conservation program. And as you can see, one of their 4 citations was a huge amount. Their total citations was about $87,300. Not all of these were noise related, but the bulk of them were. OSHA is enforcing the noise standard. So just for risk management for your company, that's something we have to consider, and a very good reason for having a good and effective hearing conservation program and complying with the noise standard. The other reason is this is a phenomenal thing that we have, this ability to hear. Sound waves are a pressure wave. What I'd like you to do now, if you're interested, to experience how this pressure wave works from a physics standpoint, is kind of put your fingers around your windpipe on your throat. And just to yourself, if you just want to say the word hum and then hold that M, you will feel the vibrations occurring in your voice box. Those vibrations, those movements of those parts of our body are disturbing atoms in the air that transfer through the media we know as air, and it approaches our ear, our apana. And that wave energy, that mechanical wave energy, enters into the ear here, and it runs into the tympanic membrane, or the eardrum. And it transfers that mechanical energy through 3 little bones that move. They move in such a degree that they're attached to the cochlea, which is essentially a long tube that's rolled up and it's filled with fluid. There's a little window here that this bone is attached to, and as it moves that bone, it moves the fluid, and so this mechanical energy becomes hydraulic energy inside the cochlea. Inside the cochlea, there are little tiny hairs, we'll call them. They're called cilia. Those cilia move based on the movement of the fluid around them. So that hydraulic energy is then transferred through a nerve as electric energy that we recognize as sound, or as noise if it's a nuisance to us. But to me, this is an amazing system of energy transference that we should protect, because it can be quite fragile, and it's something that you really don't get back. If parts of this whole system are damaged, the ability to perceive those sound pressure levels just disappears. And so it's worth protecting. It's a valuable part of the quality of our life, and it's, in my opinion, it's just a really neat thing. These are those cilia through an electron microscope, and this is what healthy cilia look like. Damaged ones can be bent over, but can recover. But through extended exposure, those cilia can literally be torn away, and they do not grow back. They shear off, and you lose the ability to hear. That's common with occupational exposure. This is the phenomena that occurs, and it occurs at certain frequencies. It tends to target different parts of the cochlea. We don't understand that necessarily to the greatest degree, but we can measure its effect afterwards. So now, with all of that background in place, I want to talk about the applicability and the standard and how to address this. So again, we started originally in 71 with just understanding that if you had greater than 90 decibels over 8 hours, you needed to do something about it. Well, in 83, that all changed. Now we have to know, well, we're measuring all decibel levels over 90 to see if we're at the permissible exposure limit. but we're also measuring levels at 80 to 90 and beyond to see if we're at the hearing conservation limit. We need to measure sound at a fast level, and we have to measure it at a slow response. We don't necessarily have to measure it over a broad spectrum, and we can't necessarily measure areas, but we have to measure people. And so we have something called dosimeters that do this job really, really well. This is an example of a dosimeter. The first dosimeters that came out were amazingly big, amazingly bulky, and amazingly fragile. The technology associated with noise measurement and assessment has come a long way. This is a sound level meter, and this, of course, is a source of vibration, or the sound pressure level. But this standard has gotten quite complex because people talk about noise levels, they talk about dose levels, because sound is this pressure wave, this movement of atoms through air, how it affects our ear, and what it does to us. This is where the topic of noise and medicine really come together and really get quite complex. But it is important for us to understand it is a dose-response relationship. And what that means is the louder it is, the larger the dose, and for a duration of time, it has an impact. So we have these multiple variables that make this issue of assessing what our conditions are quite complex. When you see something called the time-weighted average, that is over an 8-hour period. That is directly tied to that very first regulation of 90 decibels, and that's the permissible exposure level. And that is over an 8-hour period. That's the threshold value that if you're below that, you're safe. You're good to go. The standard is not applicable. If you're at or above that, you're at the permissible exposure level. Now, because of what happened in '83, an additional complexity now exists. And that's, well, if you're at 85 decibels, you're at what's called the action level, or the hearing conservation level, another threshold value. And if you're at this level over an 8-hour period, and it's a different number if it's a 10-hour shift, and it's a different number if it's a 12-hour shift. So you can see how we're progressively moving away from a very simple concept to a more convoluted one, which makes this a challenge, but not one that can't be overcome as to how to manage this. You now need to have a hearing conservation program in place, and we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics. But I want you guys to be aware that there are two other levels that don't often get talked about, but are contained within the regulation. And one is for a slow response, 15-minute exposure of 115 decibels. That essentially relates to a short-term exposure limit, if you've heard that term in exposure management. One a lot of people miss is that on a fast response, an intermittent noise, we can never exceed 140 decibels. So even if these numbers are good, safe, we have to make sure these numbers are good and safe too. Because of all these variables, it's really a situational decision that needs to be made as to how it might be applicable in your specific workplace. And so our plan for evaluating noise exposures, for conducting this hazard assessment, which you're required to do for all hazards per OSHA, is you want to identify and characterize high noise sources in your environment. My best advice for this is get an app on your phone that has a sound level meter. It does not have to be a type 1 or a type 2 or a highly specific instrument. You're essentially doing a qualitative assessment to see, well, how loud is that new saw that we brought in? Or since we moved the bander near the tumbler, how noisy is it for the guys that are working 8 feet away from that? You can easily start with your phone and just see if you're getting levels that are above 80 decibels, that are above 90 decibels. Start there with understanding what instruments, what processes in your work environment are creating noise. And then you begin to look, because noise, because it travels through air or media, is directly related to distance. So you got to say, well, okay, we've got this piece of equipment here. Where are our people that are working in close proximity? Because I want you to know that distance is our friend when it becomes when it's increased from the source of this noise or pressure level. It's good to be further away from a noise because the impact of that is weaker to us. Noise weakens, this pressure level dissipates, this wave dissipates over distance. And then what you need to do is you need to sample the impacted employees. And it's very important that your hazard assessment include all employees with similar exposures. You don't necessarily have to do every single employee. I'm not an advocate for that. I do believe more data is better, but don't get data just for the sake of it. You want to get your information in a strategic way. But if there's any difference in variables in their exposure, like time in that area or distance from that area, that triggers how many different employees you want to sample. There's kind of a golden rule that if you have 10 people that are essentially doing the same job and they're in the same exposure, you want to have at least one, preferably two samples for 10 positions. But that's assuming they're all the same. If they vary, then you have to look at sampling for a group of employees. And then what you want to do is repeat monitoring periodically, because this phenomena can change. It can change as you bring in new equipment. It can change with changes in production. It's not a requirement to the standard, but it's kind of a best practice or a rule of thumb that you want to be sampling about every 3 years. Some people sample annually. There is no problem with that. Some people sample every 2 years. Some people sample once and they don't sample until they have a significant change. The standard does not dictate how you have to do it. You just are required as a safety professional to be aware of the hazards that are present in your work environment. As those conditions change, you need to reevaluate those hazards. So ways to get this done. Options for you to do this evaluation. You can do it yourself. You can go online. You can rent these dosimeters. You can do the testing on your own. In order to meet the standard, they need to be what's called a type 2 dosimeter. They need to be calibrated before and after. There's some complexity in the use of them, but it's not something that anyone with a little bit of willingness to learn could do on their own. You can call OSHA consultation. You can request that they come in and help with your assessment. You can call private consultants. There's many different vendors that will help with this assessment. What I want you to be aware of, though, is reading these results can be a challenge, because are you dealing with a decibel level? Are you dealing, we've got all these variables with this dose response relationship. We want to know, are they presenting it as a percent of dose, and what does that mean? And is that a percent of dose of the hearing conservation level or the permissible exposure limit, or is it that short-term limit? So because of all these variables, please make sure you're working with someone that's experienced in this and knows how to simplify those, because it can really be simplified to one or two things. Are you below and safe, or are you above and do you have something to do? Do you have applicability and need to now change your focus to the compliance needs of the standard? And that's our next topic, is compliance. There are really kind of three triggers for compliance, three necessary items. You need to have a written program for noise. Now, even if you have a noise-free environment, even if you fall below these threshold values, you should have a written program. And literally, this can be a one-page document that indicates we have assessed our environment on this date for noise using these tools, and it was determined we are below the OSHA exposure limits per 1910-95. But that becomes what I call a golden ticket, because it documents that you've done your noise exposure, you've assessed for that hazard, and if OSHA or your insurance company or anybody involved in risk management with your agency wants to know, well, what's the noise like in your environment? You have a golden ticket to show them. Now, for many environments, it needs to get much more complex, the written program, but it can, again, be very simple if you don't have it. But it just needs to show that you've done an evaluation and what is the result or the consequence of that evaluation. Now, if your evaluation finds out that you are above 90 decibels, and this is for an 8-hour period, there is no different permissible exposure limit for a 10-hour shift or for a 12-hour shift. It is, if you are above this as sampled for an 8-hour period, you are now legally in violation of codified law of a permissible exposure limit. The standard is still in place that you have a hazard and you need to engineer it out, or you need to use administrative controls. This can get very complex. Now, the second element deals with that hearing conservation program. That if you're greater than 85, at or greater than 85 decibels for 8 hours, but there is a different number for 10 hours and it's less, and a different number for 12 hours, so it's different than the PEL, you must have a comprehensive hearing conservation program with 5 different elements, and we'll talk about those, but that includes training and assessments and hearing conservation and audiometric testing. But that's how the standard now exists. There are criteria that exist, and if you're above those threshold values based on your noise assessment, you have compliance requirements. So the ways to eliminate and reduce your exposure with this phenomena of this sound pressure level, it still is preferable, and it's required if you're above 90 decibels, that you look at engineering controls. And those can include things like soundproofing, machines enclosures. And again, remember, distance is our friend. Administrative controls, limiting the time employees are in a specific area. I work with a number of people that have some very robust sounds, and that is the tool that they have to use. They can't engineer it away. Even with double hearing protection, with using custom hearing protection and earmuffs, trying to get the maximum attenuation, you still can't get people below the exposure level, and you have to rely on administrative controls. There are ways to solve this, but they're all situationally dependent. Here's an example of just enclosing a piece of equipment, reducing the sound waves as it emanates from this piece of equipment. Here's another one, using a dampening material, a suppression material over a piece of equipment. I got to tell you, there's simpler things to do. Just take a look at your equipment and see if it's a bad bearing that's causing it. See if it's vibration because it's sitting directly on the floor. Because realize a solid material waves can pass through a solid material, a gaseous material, or a liquid material. Sound goes through all of those things. So just those preventative maintenance programs are things that you can do to help. And that's what your approach should be when looking at engineering solutions, is you should try and get more information about what's going on when you're identifying and characterizing the source of these noise. A tool that's often used is a sound pressure level meter, which is a type 1, so it has a higher degree of specificity, and it does octave band analysis. Again, sound is a very interesting thing to us. Elephants can hear sounds that we can't. They can hear sounds at much lower frequencies, below our ability to perceive what those sounds are. Young people can hear noises that a 20-year-old can hear noises that a 40-year-old cannot. They can hear at higher frequencies. When you're looking at controlling noises from a known source, you want to know which sounds at which level are coming from which frequencies, because that will impact the approach you use to engineer those solutions. The other key element and approach that I believe is a must is you have to involve operations with these elimination tactics and strategies. I've been involved with companies that have just relied on repositioning equipment, changing their manufacturing process and flow with operations that have honestly accomplished two goals. It's increased production and it's reduced noise hazard. So that sort of evaluation should be a part of looking at an engineering solution to a noise exposure. And then as you are implementing these these engineering solutions or these changes in production solutions, make sure you continue to evaluate. This is a real performance orientated approach. Don't rely on the theoretical approach. Don't rely on what happened at another facility. You can use that information in your tactic, but because of the complex nature of sound and how it can be influenced by so many things, you have to find that custom solution for your environment. I have seen the exact same solutions on the exact same equipment have dramatically different results because of where they were positioned and other variables in the environment. So that's why you measure as you go, and you approach it from a performance orientated approach. So help for this and options can include, again, doing it yourself. Equipment vendors are fantastic and often tend to be fantastic sources of information. So if you have a piece of equipment that's making noise, call the guy that sold it to you and say, hey, I can't be alone. How have other consumers of this product, users of this product, addressed this issue? And the great vendors, they'll get you involved with others and they'll get you resources and potential solutions to try at your facility. I've had great success in my history with working with equipment vendors. Private consultants can be brought in too. We help people with assessments. There are many other people that can assist with these engineering assessments, but make sure, again, that you're working with someone that understands this all has to be incorporated with operations, because you can have the best solution, but if it dramatically impacts operations, they don't get used. They get dropped out, they get avoided, they get circumvented. It's very important that these solutions incorporate with operations, with production. Now we're to the management of the hearing conservation program and some of the complexity of the hearing conservation program and the requirements. I think one key element is there are many time-sensitive criteria associated with a hearing conservation program. Even an experienced manager with hearing conservation program can get frustrated with all of the different time requirements. It's a lot to keep track of. But baseline audiograms, which is the first audiogram an employee would get when they come to work for you. And then an annual audiogram is an audiogram that needs to be completed every 12 months from their date of hire. But you want to know what their current ability to hear is with a baseline audiogram. And then what you do is you compare how noise in your work environment has affected their ability to hear with annual audiograms. Well, another element that's very important in a hearing conservation program is the hearing protection needs to be provided by the employer, but it needs to accommodate the employee. It needs to work well with the employee. There are all sorts of hearing protective devices out there. I am a huge fan of earmuffs. There are many people that would rather have their teeth scraped than wear earmuffs. I get that. Some people like those little foam plugs. They could be good too. Some people like the tethered blockers. There are a lot of solutions for hearing protective devices. You have to find the one that works with your employees, that gets utilized by your employees, and that attenuates the sound and protects your employees. And then training and education. It is very important that all employees understand it is their responsibility to follow the directions of management and safety when it comes to using these. That needs to be reiterated. Um, you as a manager or someone accountable have to make sure your employees are wearing these protective devices, or that can lead to another citation. Training needs to be done on initial employment and then annual training thereafter with the standard. That training needs to include the proper donning and doffing of hearing protective devices, how to use and read and understand audiograms, and again, how to protect oneself from exposure to noise in the workplace. And then record keeping, we could talk about that for another hour. There's a lot of record keeping requirements that include information that needs to be private, the results of the hearing protection audiograms that can be public, the status of noise within the workplace, the injuries that occur that again need to be kept private as well as put on your OSHA log, but record keeping associated with the standard can be relatively complex. So a baseline audiogram, this is where you put on these headphones, red on the right, blue on the left. They're required within the first 6 months of employment unless you use a mobile testing van, and then you're given up to 1 year. My advice is to do this sooner rather than later. I apologize. Is someone trying to ask a question?
Actually, real quick, Bill, I have a question for you. Just to confirm, the audiograms are for those jobs that the employer deems needs them. It's not required for every employee.
That's exactly right. And we're going to talk about that as a tactic in just a few minutes here. Every employee is not required to have an audiogram. It's only those employees that have an exposure either for 8, 10, or 12 hours, because there are 3 different levels that exceed that threshold limit. But if you'll give me just a little time, I would like to talk about that tactic a little bit further into my presentation. It's a level of sophistication, and it's a very important distinction. So I'm glad that that question was asked, but there is no requirement that all employees do it. It's only those employees that exceed those threshold limits. So the baseline audiograms, annual audiograms occur at least 1 year after that, and there's a comparison made between to try and identify what's called a shift. And so this is a reflection, and there's many ways to reflect that, but the right ear has certain has little less than signs for one of the tests that was done, and then it has circles indicating the other test. One of these is a baseline, and it gets compared to the annual audiogram for each year at many different frequencies. And those numbers on the bottom are frequencies. All I really want you to understand is that we're comparing to a baseline, and we're trying to understand, has this changed since this employee has been working with us? Because if it's changed, and on average between 2,000, 3,000, and 4,000, if it's changed more than 10 decibels, and this person's hearing is past the normal hearing range, which is 25 decibels, and again, I apologize to throw all these variables at you, that is now an OSHA recordable injury. And in the legal system, you're innocent until proven guilty. In the hearing conservation standard, you are guilty. If you have noise in your work environment and somebody presents with a shift, that is your injury. It does not matter if they are in a rock and roll concert every weekend and they never wear hearing protection and they wear hearing protection at your workplace. You are presumed to be the cause of that, and you have legal culpability and liability for that. Now, you can attempt to demonstrate that you're not responsible, but that is a long road to hoe. I've been involved in those before too. It's a tough thing to do, but it can be done. But know that the way the standard is written, you as the employer who have a recognized hazard with noise, and if someone has a shift, you're responsible for it. I think it's a flaw in the system, but I understand why it exists, and I'm certainly not going to be able to do anything about it other than try and manage it as effectively, ethically, and appropriately as possible. We look at the average of those three. If they've changed from the baseline to an annual one, that's a threshold shift, and that means it's an injury. So this gets kind of complex, but what I just explained verbally, it tells you what you need to do. Getting these no's can be a challenge, especially this third one. Is it hearing loss work related? It's presumed to be. You have to do quite a bit of due diligence to demonstrate that it's not. This is how it's defined in the standard, and this explains how it has to be over the 25 decibels and on average in those three frequencies. But it does become an OSHA recordable injury. You must report a threshold shift to an employee within 21 days of it occurring. In addition, you have an opportunity from your annual audiogram to retest, but only within 30 days. So another time requirement. If you retest within 30 days and it's demonstrated that that shift no longer occurs, then you do not have to report the injury. MSHA is a little bit different. They only give you 10 days. But again, it's another complexity that we have to manage as safety professionals when we have a noise hazard in the workplace. So this tactic is what I wanted to talk about and what the question was alluding to. This is a sound level map that can be developed either utilizing and should be utilized with dosimetry results and also results from a sound level meter. But for the sake of this scenario, these individuals that work with these pieces of equipment in the corner are above the hearing conservation level. The rest of these areas are not. You must involve these employees in a hearing conservation program. They must do baseline and annual audiograms. Even if you have an engineering control, well, I apologize. Even if you have an administrative control in place that protects against that, if that exposure exists over an 8-hour, 10-hour, or 12-hour time period, they need to be in the hearing conservation program. These employees do not. But if any one of these employees spends 1 day in here, then they need to be in the audiometric program. The best tactic I've seen is you do hearing protective devices for everybody in the shop. Everybody wears them. Doesn't matter. I'm not going to delineate from you wearing them or you wearing them. You don't have to. Everybody wears them in the shop. But audiograms for only the ones that need to apply. That to me is the best way to manage a hearing conservation program if this phenomena exists in your workplace. So now hearing protective devices. Again, I talked about many different ones, but please know and understand it is really important that you train people on how to use them. You really got to roll up those little ones and you got to shove them way inside your ear canal and you got to feel them block out sound. You really can. Know that cotton is not an earplug. Again, with earmuffs, you got to make sure that they're working properly, that someone doesn't have glasses that are making them not work, because sound will go through any little crack and it can still cause an issue. You need to have your employees trained on how to properly maintain this particular piece of equipment that's been given to them and that's used. Employees have a responsibility to participate in annual training. They need to cooperate with your testing and management of monitoring this hazard in the workplace. They need to wear the hearing protection, but you too, as an administrator or a line supervisor or someone responsible, you need to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to do. And then the hearing protection needs to be clean and of course provided. Some things can be washed. I'm a big advocate for custom hearing protection. There's a company called Ear Inc. that sells them. I know that there's vendors in the area that do it. They will make an ear mold that is just for you. It fits right inside your ear. Some people struggle with them. Many people do not. They provide a really good attenuation and hearing protection. But other people just like the earplugs. Some people like earmuffs. You, with a hearing conservation program that requires the use of hearing protection or is mandated by as an employer, should make sure that people are wearing them properly. So again, keys to effective management. This is an elephant. This is a big thing. There's a lot of complexity to this. Share the load. Work with internal and external resources. If just the safety guy is making sure the hearing conservation program is going to work, I've never seen one work that way. It has to be a shared responsibility from all levels, from the new guy working on the line to administration to the line supervisors. They all can play a role in this, and they all should. Utilize your external resources, vendors, consultants, the internet, OSHA itself. There is a lot of information out there, and share the load as to how to do this. Talk to people at conferences or over Zoom meetings and find out how they're managing things to share that load. Make sure you're a good time manager. There are so many time limitations and time sensitive components of a hearing conservation program that you want to meet them. A key one is that retest. Get that retest done within 30 days. If your vendor that's providing the initial audiogram is not giving you results in a timely manner, you got to push them. You got to say, I need those results. I need to know who needs to be retested. We need to get this done. We've only got 30 days to do it. You need to report to your employees. Oftentimes, reporting is done at the time of the audiogram just to let you know. So it may not be a big criteria for you, but if it's not done that way, you got to make sure that that's done. You got to make sure you're testing these employees at the right time, doing it with their baseline or their annual audiograms. And then really learn from others and know that there's always ways to continually improve with how to manage a hearing conservation program and noise exposure. Things are always changing with this. Companies' production change. The boss finds some piece of equipment that he thinks is going to save millions of dollars, and he brings it in, and all of a sudden you have another issue that you need to deal with, and you need to improve the situation. So know that continuous improvement and learning and working with others is a really key component of effective management of a hearing conservation program. Again, some of your options, and I honestly think all of these should be utilized at some degree or another, and at some time or another, as your business entity is managing hearing conservation. There must be an internal capacity. You can't just hire people to come in and do this for you. It just cannot work that way because of its complexity and because of its its unique situation to your specific environment. So use service providers like occupational medicine providers in the area. They did a lot with this. Use associations. You can become KOC certified and learn all about this sort of thing. And I would suggest you use private consultants, use the vendors, use all sorts of service providers to manage this highly variable situation. But I want you to know that as you chunk these things off, as you take care of these things, it gets easy. It gets relatively routine. It's something that can be done. I've seen it done literally at hundreds of companies. And so whether you're just starting out or whether you think you're lost because you're taking over from somebody else, there is a way to help your employees protect this sense, our ability to hear. There are things you can do to effectively manage a program. And it's my hope that you found this presentation somewhat useful. I don't have a lot of time here. I'm glad we interrupt, but if there are any additional questions, please feel free to let me know.
So Bill, I have a few questions here for you really quickly. First off, I appreciate the comments on this, that once you kind of get over that big hurdle, it's not too hard, but it's that hurdle to kind of get over when you're initially studying it. Do you have a copy of like a written statement or a program that members could potentially access to use as a reference?
OSHA does. And I would use
OSHA.
that standard because that's who's going to be looking at it. But there are templates that are available for OSHA for a written hearing conservation program. You just need to modify it to your specific situation.
And then the other question is, you had mentioned earlier there are some apps that can be uploaded onto or downloaded onto your phone. Are you familiar with any specific ones?
No, I've used a couple different ones. Like with lots of apps, I find one that works, but then for some reason it doesn't work so well later. So I just go back to the Google store and download a different one and find one that works. But I want you to realize that's a qualitative measurement. Don't rely on that for data that you're going to manage your risk with. But that's a good way to kind of see what's going on. You can, whip out your phone as they're testing a piece of equipment, or they move some things and say, oh, wow, okay, we've potentially got an issue here. Now you need to bring in the type 2 and the type 1 instruments that the standard requires. But it's a very good assessment tool.
Awesome. And then last question I have is, you had stated to analyze your noise levels every 3 years, or if there's been a 20% change in production.
Those are rules of thumb.
Okay, so if nothing has really changed in production, is it necessary to do the testing?
No, there is nothing that mandates a timed requirement for doing the testing. You have to do it at least once, but things change, people change. If you've been putting milk into containers for the last 40 years, and you have equipment that's old and your process hasn't changed, your containers have changed, your production have changed. Maybe a window was installed. Maybe you're storing things in a different area than what you did 3 years ago. All of those things can affect sound. So it's a good practice to do it. I would hesitate to go more than 5 years. 3 years is kind of that rule of thumb. But if your production changes, you should look at reassessing your hazard. But there's nothing that says you must do it every year.
Thank you. That's all I have for you right now, Bill.
Well, thank you guys again for the opportunity. We really appreciate it at OECS working with you guys, and know that we're available to help. And that's what we like to do is help build strong safety cultures. And so I appreciate again this opportunity to talk about a subject that I'm certainly interested in.
Thank you, Bill, for this great information, reminders, as you mentioned at the beginning of this, for some of it, but hopefully everybody gleaned some new information out of it, some good practices. So thank you, everybody, for attending. Please, and thank you, Bill, for your time for today and everything else. As a reminder, surveys were sent out, so make sure that you're filling that out, and take the time to fill that out and give some good positive feedback for Bill. We appreciate it. I guess from that standpoint, thank you, everybody, for attending, and have a great, safe day and week.